In a moment meant to showcase Korea's military might, disaster struck. As Kim Jong-un stood proudly beside his daughter, a brand new 5,000-ton warship, the largest in the nation's history, rolled into the water and immediately began to sink. What should have been a symbol of dominance became a global humiliation, captured by satellites and leaked to the world before state media could spin it. Now, insiders report Kim is furious, launching investigations, demanding arrests, and blaming criminal negligence. This isn't just a shipwreck, it's a regime-shaking failure playing out on the world stage. Here's what really happened. When power sinks. It was meant to be a moment of glory, a grand unveiling, a towering new destroyer, the largest North Korea had ever built, sliding into the sea to announce its arrival as a maritime power. Instead, it became a slow-motion collapse, a national humiliation witnessed by the most powerful eyes in the country. On the dock stood Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader, flanked by his carefully curated inner circle and his daughter Kim Joo-ae. State photographers captured him in real time, his expression fixed, stoic, rehearsed. But what happened next wasn't in the script. As the 5,000-ton warship met the water, it listed heavily, it tilted. Then it stopped moving altogether. Not sailing, not floating, just stuck. Partially submerged, hull crushed, dead in the water. South Korean military surveillance confirmed what Pyongyang tried to hide. The ship had capsized during its launch. Later satellite photos showed the vessel tilted at a severe angle, cranes hastily surrounding the site. The global media pounced within hours. For a regime obsessed with optics, it was the nightmare scenario. Their military masterpiece sinking in full view of the world. Even North Korea's own tightly controlled state media had to admit sections of the hull had been crushed. A rare admission, a crack in the veil. This wasn't just technical failure, it was symbolic. A nation that prides itself on strength, watching its own creation collapse under its own weight. This wasn't a launch, said one South Korean defense analyst. It was a collapse of image in real time. But in North Korea, accidents aren't just unfortunate, they're unforgivable. Behind the scenes, the regime wasn't planning damage control, it was preparing for punishment. When failure becomes treason. In most nations, a failed launch might mean a quiet inquiry or a reassessment of protocol. But in North Korea, failure is heresy. Within 24 hours, internal communications from Pyongyang made it clear. The sinking wasn't seen as an accident, it was labeled a crime. Kim Jong-un called it a criminal act of carelessness and irresponsibility. Not an error, not a miscalculation, a betrayal. The language of military embarrassment quickly shifted into the language of political treason. Reports began to surface of high-ranking naval officers and engineers being detained for questioning. Internal memos reportedly described the event as a direct threat to the dignity of the nation. For Kim, this wasn't just about steel and rivets. It was about face, both domestically and internationally. Every military unveiling is part of a larger propaganda campaign. A show of strength, a carefully choreographed performance. The destroyer was meant to embody the regime's growing technological might. Its failure pierced that illusion, and someone would pay the price. Analysts familiar with North Korean power structures say this kind of event almost always leads to purges. Not just demotions, but imprisonment, exile, even execution. In the DPRK, failing a warship launch is like insulting the portrait of Kim Il-sung, said one defector. It becomes a spiritual offense, not just a technical one. Mistakes don't exist in North Korea, said a former intelligence officer. Only enemies pretending to be loyal. But behind the spectacle and the fury lies a deeper, technical story. What exactly went wrong? And how did North Korea's most ambitious warship get crushed? By its own weight? What sank, technically? By all accounts, the ship was a 5,000-ton destroyer-class vessel, the largest ever constructed by North Korea. It was meant to mark a turning point in DPRK naval power. But from the moment construction began, There were signs of a dangerous mismatch. Big ambition built on outdated methods. According to South Korean and U.S. intelligence, the ship's launch was botched due to a failed side launch, a method in which the vessel is rolled into the water sideways rather than straight in. It's a launch style most advanced navies abandoned decades ago. The reason? It's unstable, risky, and extremely difficult to execute at scale. For a ship this large, side launching is like trying to balance a skyscraper on its side, then hoping it falls safely. Instead, the ship buckled. Satellite imagery shows a warped midsection, structural damage consistent with weight imbalance. Sources say the hull may have twisted during the launch, unable to withstand its own mass. The keel, as the backbone of the ship, may have cracked under pressure. In naval terms, it's one of the worst ways to fail. Experts say the incident highlights North Korea's outdated shipbuilding infrastructure. Lacking access to advanced materials, precision sensors, and global naval engineering networks due to sanctions, the DPRK is essentially building modern-looking ships with Cold War-era tools. They can copy the shell, but not the systems. They're building for image, not performance, said a South Korean naval analyst. And eventually, reality catches up. This destroyer was supposed to change the balance of power in East Asia. A nuclear-capable, radar-equipped flagship. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. But to understand why its failure hit so hard, we need to look at what the ship was meant to be. The destroyer that could have been. This was no ordinary ship. The destroyer that now lies crippled in dock was designed to be North Korea's most advanced warship ever. State propaganda had hyped it for months. Leaked renderings showed a vessel with vertical launch systems, VLS, possibly even nuclear capable. It was meant to signal something new. North Korea wasn't just testing missiles anymore. It was building platforms to carry them. If completed, this destroyer would have shifted the regional balance of power. It was expected to house long-range radar, anti-aircraft systems, and possibly cruise missile launchers with the potential to reach targets well beyond the Korean Peninsula. It was a ship meant to threaten, to intimidate, to send a message not just to Seoul but to Tokyo and Washington. For Kim Jong-un, this wasn't just about defense. It was about image, a high-seas symbol of national pride. The destroyer was to be the crown jewel of North Korea's naval modernization, proof that despite sanctions, the regime could still build like a superpower. Its presence at future military parades and missile drills was practically guaranteed. But now it's a dead weight, sinking in every sense of the word. Instead of projecting dominance, the failed launch has exposed the regime's industrial vulnerabilities. What was intended as a bold leap forward has become a cautionary emblem of overreach. They tried to show off power, said a Japanese defense analyst. What they showed instead was fragility. This destroyer was never just a warship, said a former naval engineer. It was a symbol, and symbols carry weight until they collapse. But while military observers watched the steel, the world saw something more telling. The face beside Kim Jong-un as the disaster unfolded. His daughter, Kim Jong-un. Her presence was no accident. Inside North Korea's naval modernization, this destroyer wasn't a one-off experiment. It was the centerpiece of North Korea's most ambitious naval program in decades. For years, the regime had focused on small patrol boats and coastal defense. But this ship marked a dramatic pivot toward blue water capability, toward maritime projection, toward showing the world that the DPRK could operate beyond its shores. Internally, the project was labeled a pillar of military reinvention. It integrated layers of technology, a base hull modeled after Soviet-era designs, outfitted with North Korean-built electronics, and according to some analysts, possibly influenced by Chinese naval architecture. It was built in stages, under strict secrecy, across multiple dockyards to avoid detection. But satellites saw everything. The financial and manpower cost was massive. At a time when North Korea's economy is under extreme pressure, the ship absorbed millions in resources, thousands of skilled workers, and years of engineering labor. That's what made the failure even more devastating. It wasn't just a launch mishap. It was the collapse of a central narrative that North Korea, despite isolation, could build anything it wanted. Internally, this setback shakes Kim's powerful nation doctrine, a policy that links military progress directly to the regime's political legitimacy. The destroyer was meant to be proof of progress, not a tomb for it. In North Korea, military development is theater, said a defector who once worked in weapons design. If the curtain falls too soon, heads roll backstage. The ship wasn't just meant to sail, said a South Korean analyst. It was meant to carry Kim's myth across the sea. And standing beside that myth on launch day was the regime's most curious new symbol, a teenage girl in a black coat watching the future crack open in front of her. Kim Jong-un in the dynastic stage. She was introduced to the world as beloved child, then later described by state media with a far more loaded title, the respected and great person of guidance. That title, once reserved only for top officials and Kim Jong-un himself, was applied to Kim Jong-un, his daughter, and likely heir. Her presence at the destroyer's unveiling was more than ceremonial. It was dynastic messaging. For months, Jong-un has been slowly stepping into the spotlight, appearing at missile launches, military parades, even state dinners. But watching a military failure, live, has now become part of her public political memory. The regime cannot erase that moment. And in North Korea, even a child's image is deeply choreographed. Analysts say this may accelerate her indoctrination into leadership, perhaps even toughen her public image. In DPRK mythology, leaders are forged through crisis, not comfort. If this ship had launched perfectly, she would have been praised as a lucky charm. Instead, she may now be seen as a witness to shame or more dangerously, as a symbol of unfinished legacy. Some experts believe the regime may use the failure to double down on her image, that she'll appear again at the repaired launch, a redemption arc written in real time. Others warn the incident could scar her early political narrative, making her presence a reminder of weakness. Either way, Jong-un is no longer just a daughter. She's now a figure in the making, part of the story whether she wants to be or not. She's being groomed, said a defector from the Korean Workers' Party, not just to lead someday, but to inherit the burden of her father's failures. While the regime tries to reframe the narrative, the world isn't waiting. Eyes in the sky caught everything, and what they saw was far worse than anything state media dared to admit. How the world saw it unfold. In North Korea, failure is meant to be invisible. But in today's world, nothing stays hidden, especially from above. Within hours of the failed launch, satellite networks across the globe had eyes on the scene. The South Korean military, always watching the shipyards of Sinpo and Nampo, spotted the damage first. But soon, American analysts saw it too. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency confirmed the warship had tilted, with naval cranes surrounding it and recovery operations underway. Images shared across the Five Eyes Alliance, an intelligence sharing network between the U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, showed clear evidence of structural collapse. The destroyer's hull was visibly warped, the launch site scattered with debris. North Korea tried to respond, launching jamming signals to block observation drones and disrupt satellite sweeps. But it was too late. The story had already left the ground. International media outlets began circulating high-res images of the failed launch. For a regime that controls every camera, every frame, and every sentence printed within its borders, this was the ultimate loss of control. They build for secrecy, said a former U.S. intelligence officer, but the sky doesn't lie. And this time, the sky told the story before they could. Even North Korean citizens, despite censorship, began whispering. Foreign radio broadcasts hinted at a setback. South Korean propaganda balloons carried leaflets with images of the wreck. The regime couldn't contain it. The destroyer, once meant to project untouchable military prestige, had become a global spectacle of failure. But this wasn't just a technical embarrassment. It was a nuclear delay. Because this destroyer wasn't just steel and sensors. It was supposed to carry the regime's most terrifying weapon. Nuclear dreams, sunken reality. This warship wasn't just a symbol, it was a platform. According to multiple intelligence reports, the destroyer was designed to be nuclear-ready, fitted with vertical launch systems, VLS, that could eventually hold submarine-launched ballistic missiles or cruise missiles modified for sea deployment. It was North Korea's next move in developing a second strike capability, the ability to retaliate after a nuclear attack. For a regime obsessed with deterrence, this ship was a big step toward regional parity. Unlike its submarines, which are limited in range and stealth, a nuclear-ready destroyer could linger off coasts, show flag presence, and complicate U.S. and South Korean military planning. It wasn't just about capability, it was about psychological weight. The failure has now set that vision back by at least 2 to 3 years, according to Western defense analysts. Not only does the ship need repair or replacement, but the confidence in the underlying naval engineering is now in question. If the hull couldn't survive launch, how would it handle missile recoil? How would its radar survive electronic warfare? And yet, experts warn, this doesn't mean the dream is dead. North Korea's nuclear ambitions have proven disturbingly resilient. The setback is tactical, not strategic. The desire for nuclear naval capability remains. If anything, the public embarrassment may accelerate underground efforts. The regime may shift resources towards submarine-launched platforms, which are harder to track and less visible to public failure. This isn't the end of the program, said a Japanese naval analyst. It's just a leak in the timeline. The threat remains, but now we know where the cracks are. And as the regime stares down its own exposed vulnerabilities, the internal machinery begins to churn. In North Korea, failure doesn't just sink ships, it sinks people. And the blame game has already begun. Inside the North Korean fallout. In North Korea, mistakes are never just mistakes, they're betrayals. From the moment the destroyer capsized, the gears of state punishment began to grind. Engineers, naval officers, technicians. Already, sources suggest investigations are underway, targeting those responsible for every bolt, weld, and calculation. It's not just technical personnel under scrutiny. Insiders say the regime's propaganda department is under fire too, for overselling the destroyer's readiness. Some are accused of pushing the launch before structural testing was complete. In a system where no one dare say not ready, the result was predictable. Failure, followed by fear. Behind the scenes, internal memos have begun reframing the disaster. One leaked briefing from Pyongyang's naval command suggests the possibility of foreign sabotage, a common deflection tactic when things go wrong. Blaming outside forces is a way to redirect public rage and reassert control. But inside military circles, the truth is known. The failure was homegrown. Expectations now point to purges, arrests, demotions, possibly worse. Kim Jong-un's rhetoric in the days after the disaster described the launch as an insult to the dignity of the revolution. Language like that has consequences. In the DPRK, political survival often depends on proximity to blame and how quickly you can deflect it. In North Korea, blame is a blood sport, said a former high-ranking defector. When something breaks, someone disappears. The clock is ticking. Orders have already gone out for unconditional restoration. But experts say the damage is far beyond repair in the short term, which means the search for scapegoats will continue until someone pays the price, publicly or privately. And looming over all of this chaos is a deadline, set not by engineering but by politics. Kim Jong-un wants the warship standing by June, and if it isn't, the next collapse won't be in steel, it'll be in power. Repair or regime humiliation. In North Korea, there is no time for failure, and certainly no time for delay. Following the warship's disastrous collapse, Kim Jong-un issued a directive. The destroyer must be fully restored and relaunched before the June plenary session of the Workers' Party, a date not just circled on calendars, but carved into the regime's political timeline. The order, according to insiders, was delivered with urgency and fury. The June session is a key propaganda event where the regime broadcasts its victories. Not meeting the deadline doesn't just mean missing a launch, it means exposing weakness at a moment when the state must appear infallible. But experts say the demand is technically impossible. The hull damage is extensive. The ship's structural integrity is compromised. Even under ideal conditions, with unlimited resources and time, such a rebuild would take 6 to 12 months. North Korea doesn't have either. Internally, this is creating a pressure cooker. Engineers are being told to do the impossible. Officers are being warned their careers or lives depend on success. This isn't just repair under duress. It's political theater with hostages behind the curtain. In North Korea, deadlines don't reflect logistics, said a South Korean defector. They reflect ego and fear. Failure to meet the June deadline won't be a quiet embarrassment. It will be a national disgrace, witnessed by top party officials, foreign intelligence agencies, and, most importantly, Kim's own inner circle. The regime must either fake success or face fallout. And while Kim's workers scramble in secret, the outside world is already reacting, not with panic, but with new moves. Because even a sunken ship can change the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula. What this means: for the Korean Peninsula, North Korea's destroyer may be dead in the water, but regional tensions are anything but calm. The failure was a blow to Pyongyang's prestige, yes, but it was also a reminder to Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington that the regime is desperate to project strength, even when it's clearly struggling to build it. In response to the failed launch, South Korea raised its naval readiness. Additional patrols were deployed near disputed maritime zones. Japan increased aerial surveillance, especially near missile sites and naval docks along the DPRK coast. And while the U.S. Navy didn't flinch, sources confirmed it views the failure as both a relief and a warning. This tells us two things, said a U.S. defense analyst. First, North Korea still lags in military engineering. But second, they're willing to rush development at all costs. In other words, yes, they failed, but no, they're not slowing down. Ironically, the failed launch may make North Korea more dangerous. Desperation leads to unpredictability. Kim may order faster missile tests, more provocative sea patrols, or even false claims of success to keep up appearances. Embarrassment is often followed by escalation, especially in authoritarian regimes. When their weapons don't speak loudly, said a Japanese naval officer, they make sure their propaganda does. But the warship failure is more than military misfire. It's the latest sign of a much deeper issue: North Korea's inability to evolve its military without cracking its system from within. North Korea's struggle with modern warfare. Modern warfare requires more than missiles. It demands innovation, iteration, risk, and most importantly, failure tolerance. The ability to test, break, and improve. But in North Korea, failure is forbidden. And that's exactly why its military dreams keep collapsing under their own weight. Sources say North Korean military industries are crippled by secrecy. Projects are built in silos, isolated from each other, disconnected from global knowledge. Engineers aren't allowed to speak freely. Designers can't admit flaws. Progress is reported, not questioned. As a result, North Korea builds big but blind. Sanctions only worsen the problem. Without access to foreign materials, digital systems, or precision tools, Pyongyang is forced to reverse engineer outdated technology, then scale it up with whatever materials are available. The destroyer was a perfect example, a Frankenstein fusion of old Soviet concepts mixed with patchwork domestic upgrades. And when things go wrong, the solution isn't redesign, it's repression. Failures are covered up, not studied. Mistakes are punished, not learned from. That's not a path to modern warfare. It's a path to repeated disaster. North Korea's military is like a machine with no oil, said a former South Korean admiral. It still moves, but only by force. And eventually the gears snap. And when those gears snap, especially in public, they don't just damage steel and rivets. They tear at the heart of the regime itself. Because in North Korea, control isn't optional. It's everything. What sinks when power fails? The collapse of the warship isn't just the story of a failed launch. It's a metaphor for a regime that confuses control with competence. Kim Jong-un doesn't just rule North Korea, he directs its theater. Every test, every parade, every new ship is part of an illusion that the system is working, that power flows seamlessly from the top. But that illusion cracked the moment the destroyer hit the water and failed to float. Kim's rage, the rushed cover-up, the scapegoating, these aren't signs of power. They're signs of panic. Because in a dictatorship where image is everything, reality becomes a threat. A ship that can't sail doesn't just disappoint, it exposes the limits of control. Analysts say this moment may haunt Kim's future military planning. It showed the world and his people that even in the most staged moment, the regime can still fail. That even surrounded by generals and honor guards, gravity still wins. This wasn't just a shipwreck, said one defector. It was a myth sinking in plain sight. One destroyer went down, but in its wake, it pulled something deeper with it, a piece of the regime's invincibility. And that's the kind of loss that no amount of propaganda can repair. A warship sank, but it wasn't just steel that went down. It was North Korea's illusion of infallibility. In a regime where public failure is forbidden, this disaster could trigger arrests, purges, even executions. And with a looming June deadline to restore the ship, Kim's obsession with perfection may lead to deeper chaos. As the world watches, this sunken vessel has become more than a failed launch. It's a metaphor for in a fragile state built on fear, secrecy, and desperation. Don't forget to subscribe, because in North Korea, even ships don't just sink. They expose everything beneath the surface.